Hello everyone, this is the first video in a series of 4 videos on the moral issue of abortion. Um, I'm going to go ahead and make this public, so if anybody's watching that is not in the class, understand that this is done in the context of a course on ethics and social issues. And we're going to be specifically looking at 2 well-known philosophical papers on the issue. One by Don Marquis about the immorality of abortion, and the other by Judith Jarvis Thomson. 2 very famous papers. So if you are watching this, from a public perspective, just, I know this issue can be a controversial issue, so please just understand it's in the context of a course. So this first video is just some framing to kind of set up some of the terms, and then the next one will be on Don Marquis, the one after Judith Jarvis Thomson, and then the final one, just some general comments based on an article by Marianne Garneau for public seminar titled "Is Abortion Candy?" So as most of us know, the issue is usually cut up into 2 sides. Generally, in a lot of moral issues, there's the kind of belief that there's like a pro and a con, a for and against. Most moral philosophers, and me personally, think that that's a really kind of bad way to oversimplify a lot of these very complicated moral, political, social, economic issues. It may be useful to be like a general rubric to understand the kind of lines of argument, but it's also very reductive and can have very adverse effects, especially in the political context. So for the most part, we know the positions of pro-life and pro-choice. Pro-life ostensibly being the position that the rigorous absolutist version of it being the position that no abortion not only shouldn't be legal, but it's immoral in any stage of the pregnancy. Whereas pro-choice advocates for abortion at most stages of the pregnancy, although the pro-choice position, as we will see, oftentimes is demonized as people pulling full live babies out in the 8th month of pregnancy and cutting up their parts, and all of these kinds of sensational ways that pro-life arguments often mischaracterize the pro-choice position. But the pro-choice position, given the language, is the idea it is the woman's choice, it is the family's choice, and the pro-life position from the pro-choice point of view seems to violate that autonomy. Now, a note about even that language. In both cases, there's a kind of negative concept that goes along with it that's implied just by the language. So pro-life implies that the other side, insofar as we accept these rigid bipolar demarcations, the pro-life position, it means the other side is pro-death. Whereas the pro-choice position implies that the other side has no opportunity for human autonomy or human free will in that, which, to be fair, in both cases is kind of a very limited caricature of each of the positions. Now, on the one hand, discussing the issue of abortion in a college level class, sometimes I feel a little bit that it might be a bit sophomoric, because it's perhaps been discussed ad nauseum in high school contemporary moral issue classes, much less in the news media. But nonetheless, I think it's important, if not only in the context of our course, because these 2 papers are, really good examples of philosophical argument that don't make references to specific traditions. In the case of America, usually biblical traditions, even though abortion is not really taken on in the Bible at all. It's more from a natural law perspective. I'll say more about that later. But these are two, whatever one's position is on abortion, or whatever one thinks their position is on abortion. And by that I mean a lot of times with any moral belief, they're inherited and not earned, meaning it's just kind of, and that's understandable given, just the way that we're enculturated. But a lot of times people come to the argument, whether it's abortion or capital punishment or whatever that it is, with an already existing moral belief that then they kind of apply to situations, or they pick out arguments without ever really putting that belief under some kind of critical scrutiny. So these papers, I think, are really good examples, if we can, insofar as we can evacuate the issue of abortion and all of the things that come along with that, and all of the kind of political rhetoric and emotion and partisan politics that is deployed by that. Insofar as we can do that, I think these are really great examples of how to use critical thinking and the philosophical method to unpack some of the complexities of these moral issues. Now, for various reasons, the issue of abortion has become a sort of political litmus test, a fact that I think is kind of detrimental, meaning that sometimes people will vote simply based on this single issue, or a perception of the way they think certain candidates or parties come down on this issue, to the exclusion of other things that are perhaps not only more important for their own individual lives, like income equality, like access to healthcare and education, much less, the greater good, climate change, regulation of corporations and profit and things like this. So it's, I think, an unfortunate thing that this is often used as the only fulcrum by which people tend to judge their parties and their candidates. Now, for various reasons, it seems that if one is a pro-life, anti-abortion position, automatically they assume that they are conservative, and in the case of American politics, Republican, which is interesting and contradictory. And maybe something like a libertarian maybe is a bit more consistent in their reasoning. The conservative position is also one that wants to say that the government should be hands-off, especially when it comes to individual behavior, local behavior. So it's an interesting tension, if not an outright contradiction, that on issues like this, then it's not only immoral, but they believe that the government ought legislate morality when it comes to the issue of females' bodies and choices that they make about birth. Now, of course, the conservative argument would come back and say, well, there is no contradiction because we're talking about murder, all of these kinds of things. But as we'll see, that it is not the case that the pro-choice, pro-abortion argument is necessarily a case that is pro-murder. That's the whole kind of crux. But oftentimes people who are pro-life, anti-abortion, do tend to identify with the conservative, and in our case, Republicans. Of course, there's the other tension and contradiction. If insofar as you are anti-murder, even if you want to go down that route, there's also, from that position, no outrage when there's extrajudicial assassinations overseas, or collateral damage from bombings, or capital punishment, or the other ways that large communities are not only marginalized but killed through a lot of the very military policies or global capitalist policies that contribute to that. So that's something to highlight, let's just say that. And part of the reason is because of the conservative / Republican Party's success in kind of becoming the moral arm of Christianity, more especially evangelical Christianity. Of course, there are plenty of traditions inside the Judeo-Christian Islamic faiths, just to name the ones that are most dominant in the American context, that are very liberal, progressive, even leftist. So it's not, again, it's not necessarily cut and dry, but it's this belief that the pro-life position is a pro-moral, pro-Judeo-Christian position. Of course, it's nowhere in the word is mentioned nowhere in the Bible. It's not discussed. There is one kind of moment, I believe, in Jeremiah when there's this kind of "I knew you before you were born," this idea of prophecy. But I'll leave that up to the biblical scholars to kind of unpack. Of course, the prohibition of murder is there, while at the same time there's plenty of blood and commanded not only murder in the case of, let's say, Abraham and Isaac, but maybe genocide in the case of the book of Joshua. So there's a lot of, if the religious fulcrum or the religious justification for this it goes to the Bible, there's a lot there certainly to be discussed, if not just outright refuted. But in the tradition, what it seems to have come from mostly is the tradition of natural law. And the idea is that nature itself is not necessarily something antithetical to God's goodness, God's decree, and that we can look to nature as a sort of book, and the book, another form of revelation, not only direct revelation through biblical or personal experiences, but as nature being something that God created in that belief system, then therefore it's good, and therefore the things in nature are good, and so we can look to nature for what is good. So in the case of abortion, and for that matter, a similar kind of argument against, let's say, homosexual practices, is that the function of sex, the natural function of sex, is to procreate, and anything that violates that is therefore a violation of nature, and therefore a violation of God's decree, QED. So that's that's the probably more of the theological underpinning for that. Of course, if that's the case, if one wants to go down that line, then anything that prevents the natural function of sex to end in procreation is therefore a violation of that. So that eliminates masturbation, that eliminates contraception, that eliminates sex for pleasure. So the official, at least the official Orthodox line, let's say from the Catholic Church, is consistent on that regard. But it is, if one wants to take that natural law position, it's going to be hard to kind of cut up where one draws the line with those other practices, which many people say are not only not immoral, but good practices, so that they can prevent the need for the abortion in the first place. But to be clear, the issue is, or at least the way we're going to kind of discuss it over these next few videos, is kind of along three major argument axes. First, an argument over the nature of personhood. Where do we draw the line? The extreme, as we'll see in the Don Marquis essay, the extreme position of pro-life is that it's at the moment of conception. Whereas if we look at other kind of various moments, the trimester model being the kind of primary way that we think about the development of the fetus. It's when there's a heartbeat, when there's sentience, when there's, so there's a huge kind of complicated area where people want to maybe draw that line, and then therefore once personhood is achieved, then all the rights of any human are invoked. Now, the strength of these two papers we're going to look at, I think, is that both of them don't really take on the question of personhood. And even Judith Jarvis Thomson, who I think has a very elegant and important argument, pro-abortion argument, she wants to assume that the child is a person from the get-go, even though she doesn't actually believe that. She says it at the end, but she wants to assume that, okay, let's say that we go that extreme route. Even then, you have these cases where it's clear that not only is abortion allowable, that it may be something that's morally required. So I think that's actually the strength of her paper. We'll get that. So the first one is an argument over the nature of personhood. The second one, this then leads to the second one, that abortion is killing, right? And even worse, it's the killing of an innocent, right? And it's not even killing, even the stronger language is used, murder, which quite frankly is, maybe a bit of a kind of a volatile and intentionally volatile language that's used to, kind of demonize, people who maybe have a more critical or a more complex view of the nature of abortion. Finally, the other kind of idea is that moral and legislative restriction violates autonomy. So we also want to say that, one of the important, moral goods, human goods, political goods is to maximize liberty, maximize freedom, and maximize the conditions for people to make choices that are in fact their own. And that the pro-life, anti-abortion position is something that violates that core aspect of human identity and human freedom. Now, lastly, to end this little preamble and scaffolding that'll before we go into the papers, it's so important, especially for philosophers, but anyone who wants to think seriously about these moral issues, is to understand facts. And especially in the last few years, given the political climate in this country, I mean, there's just a war on facts, and this kind of belief that every belief, moral, but even scientific or mathematical or whatever, is just one's opinion, and everybody's entitled to that. And tolerance and the kind of a humility about every belief, I think, is an important aspect of critical thinking. But also there are things that we can look at if we're trying to start to unpack the complexity of this, much less the effects of such divisiveness, that when we vote on these single issues, in the long run, perhaps makes things that are more immediately affecting our day-to-day lives put on the back burner. But one series of facts I want to look at is, and this is from the article by Marianne Garneau, Is Abortion Candy? But if we look at, in terms of when abortions are formed, she writes that 3/4 of abortions occur before 9 weeks of gestation. And a lot of times, even in that period, women don't even know that they're pregnant. And so there isn't even the kind of opportunity to even be faced with that choice, given whatever kind of considerations are going on. So this idea that the pro-abortion, pro-choice position is going out and just ripping recognizable humans out of bellies and killing them is just factually wrong. So 3/4 of them occur before 9 weeks of gestation. About 1% are performed after 20 weeks of pregnancy. And she writes, importantly, that these anomalies, severe developmental anomalies, often cannot be confirmed until after 20 weeks. These anomalies including the fetus missing a sizable part of its brain, its organs residing outside of its chest cavity, or some other disease or condition that prevents it from surviving to term, or surviving outside of the womb for long, if at all, with its life most likely being extremely painful and requiring tremendous medical intervention. And this is the important line. She emphasizes that these are wanted pregnancies. So even these ones that are realized after 20 weeks, they want the child, but it's such a diagnosis that it would be, in their minds, just detrimental to the child, to the family, to everyone, to allow the pregnancy to develop to term. So these are actually wanted pregnancies, virtually all of them, not capricious women killing babies, but women devastated to learn that the baby they wanted, and even named, isn't viable. So there's just this kind of, and it happens, in any moral position, this abstraction and this straw boogeyman that we set up as the person that's doing these evil things without the kind of context and compassion and consideration of the very difficult situation that these women and these families are put in, that define a vast majority of abortions. And then finally, in the third trimester begins at 28 weeks. And of the 1.6 million abortions that were performed in the U.S., at least ones that were reported, only 100 were performed in the third trimester. And these are usually in just, really, kind of extreme cases of, threatening the woman's life or some kind of other kind of fetal complication that goes along with it. So only 100. It's not even, it's hard to calculate that percentage-wise. So that's an important factual thing that, anyone who engages in this debate has to be aware of. And then finally, of course, a lot of the legislation and the kind of protests for and against occur around Planned Parenthood. And especially in the last couple of years, this very deceptive video where the people who purveyed that video were actually committed of a crime and now serving time for that, where it was perceived that Planned Parenthood operators were seeking out abortions to sell baby parts, which has just been completely proven to be false. And not only false, the people who purveyed it are now convicted of a crime. But let's just, bracket that for a moment and look at what Planned Parenthood actually does. So they're the largest provider of reproductive health services in the U.S., offering sexual and reproductive health care, education, and outreach to nearly 5 million women and men. And only 3% of its services are for abortions, 3%. Whereas 34% are for contraception, 42% for STI screening and treatment, and it's an important kind of social institution for the poor and the marginalized. 80% of its patients come from families at or below 150% of the poverty level. So if we look at the work they actually do, the majority of the work that Planned Parenthood does is all of the work that happens before, so that women and families are not in the position to even need to make this hard decision about abortion. So the ideas of not funding or demonizing Planned Parenthood actually work against the pro-life, anti-abortion position in a lot of ways. And if we are thinking about, if we then go back to the, kind of religious teaching of compassion and care, and we think about what, if that becomes our model for how we think about these issues, not to say that that makes it, any more clear per se, but if we use that as the foundation, then we can start thinking about, what we've talked about briefly in the class, an ethics of care, situations, relationships, and what would be the more compassionate thing to do in terms of, much less if we look at a broader kind of utilitarian, what actually lowers unwanted pregnancies, that, is a more responsible way of thinking about responsibility with sex and things like this, then it seems to me that a lot of what Planned Parenthood does actually furthers that goal, despite the kind of idea that they are just institutionalized. It's an institution of murder, which clearly, just given those numbers, it's not.